Welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter and I'll be your host for today's show. We've got a real treat in store for you guys today. We're going to be joined by John Hood. John is a pianist, a tap dancer, an author, the president of the John William Pope Foundation, and he also serves on State Policy Network's board of directors. John got together with his friend and fellow North Carolinian recently to talk about conservative fusionism. You guys might know Tony Woodleaf as the executive vice president of SPN. In a moment, we're going to listen to Tony and John talk about conservative fusionism, and then we'll come back live to answer your questions and hear from Tracy Sharp on the topic. We really want to dig into how we can lay a path forward and stitch together some of the divisiveness within our country, especially with folks who believe in free markets and liberty. Let's take a look at what they had to say, and we'll be back in just a few moments.
So John, in a nutshell, what is conservative fusionism?
Well, conservative fusionism is not a new idea. It's certainly the term's been used since the early 1960s. The modern American conservative movement is really a combination of different elements, the politics of freedom, the politics of limited government that we associate with the founders, the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, thinkers like Thomas Jefferson borrowing from John Locke and the liberal tradition. So that's one part of the American conservative fusion. And another is the politics of, I guess we would call it politics of order or tradition, which borrows from classical ideas about virtue and community and the importance of the tried and true, the greatest and best that has been thought and done, and preserving that and using that as a guide. And really a third tradition that is also commonly part of the American conservatism is a sort of a politics of practicality or realism, using common sense, not getting too carried away with abstract ideas, but focusing on what works and adapting to change because change is inevitable. We might associate the first group with libertarians, we might associate the second group with traditionalists, and the third group you might even say would be kind of describes how neoconservatives came into the movement through practical consequences rather than abstract theory.
So I've heard that described, as the three-legged stool, that Reagan in particular depended on. So what's the problem now? I mean, if the stool was good enough for Ronald Reagan, why isn't it good enough for us?
Well, in a sense, I would say that those ideas are good enough for us. Those traditions are timeless. They weren't true in 1945 or 1965 or 1985, and they're not true anymore in 2015 or 2025. That's not true. But the particular applications, that's what has to change. The traditions that we bring to the fore and apply to our problems, or the free market solutions that we apply. And in both of those cases, if you think about practicality and realism, how quickly do you move? How exactly do you design the bill? What happens if it doesn't work out according to plan? How do you adjust it? These are all things that I think apply today as much as in the past. What's different is we don't face the Soviet Union as an existential threat. We have different kinds of challenges. We obviously still have cultural, racial, other kinds of tensions, but nothing like we had in the 1960s. And so the circumstances change, but I think that the ideas are fairly timeless.
So what would you say if someone, devil's advocate, were to say, well, look, yes, the Soviets have declined, but we certainly have a potential threat in terms of China, or in terms of, Islamofascism, or kind of a worldwide ideological movement. We've got the same kinds of cultural forces that concerned, the Christian right back in the 80s. And then you've got, obviously a lot of growth in federal regulations that might upset the economic freedom folks. So it seems like there's an opportunity for them to have common cause, but they seem to be arguing amongst themselves a lot more than they used to. So why can't they get along now when they could in 1980?
Well, it is partly, I think, because there was this existential threat of the Soviet Union and international communism that was a bit more of a connective tissue, perhaps, than even the threat from China today. No one thinks that countries in Latin America are going to be like China, in the way that people feared that countries might become communist like the Soviet Union. But here's what I would say, and of course we're in a dance studio for a reason, which is that I think there is a comparison we could make to other kinds of American combinations. America is about putting things together that are different, and it's never been easy. It's always been kind of messy. So we're in a dance studio where I actually teach tap dancing, and I just want to show you real quick the three elements that came together to form American tap dancing. Tap dancing is a creation of America, just like jazz, just like American conservatism. And the first is African. It's the African step dance, which was partly religious, partly kind of snide commentary on their culture. Here's what African step dance looks like. It's very close to the ground. It looks sort of like this. Like that. Then you have what is called the hornpipe, the English style, and it's based on you're sort of acting like a sailor. It looks like this. Like that. And finally, we have the Irishman, of course. And the Irishman did the Irish clog, and I'll tell you about the Irish clog in a second because it has an interesting implication. But you've seen this if you've seen river dance. It looks something like this. Like that.
Wonderful.
So what I would say about these three traditions is you might think about the African step tradition as kind of defiant freedom. Mm-hmm. These were African traditions, and when they came to America, the slave owners tried to suppress their African traditions, and they fought back, not directly necessarily with violence, but with things like preserving their cultural traditions and defiantly dancing their dance, even though it was often illegal. In the English, the hornpipe was really the English thinking about their nautical past. So you might think of, it's sort of like creative tradition. You know, they were using tradition to tie their culture to their great nautical past by dancing like sailors, dressing up like sailors. And the Irishmen and the North English in their clogged shoes, they used to be on the farm, but the economics of farming changed, the Industrial Revolution happened. People began to go to factories and work, had to wear these hard wooden shoes. So because it was safe for safety on the factory floor, well, they made the best of it. And during breaks, during lunch, they went and made all this noise. And you might call that something like adaptive realism. Mm-hmm. You know, they may have wanted to have stayed on the farm, but it wasn't practical. They may not have wanted to work in a factory all day in hard wooden shoes, but they made the best of it. And in fact, they made wonderful things out of it. So I think that America has largely been about taking these different spices, flavors, foods, traditions, folkways, and combining them. I think the conservative movement is also about taking the best of different traditions, different ideas, different sets of ideas, and constantly mixing and matching them to address today's problems.
So do you think, now that's a very helpful illustration, and what went through my mind as I watched you is I wonder if the different tap traditions ever show up at once in John's studio and they get into a kind of a tap showdown because they can't stand parts of each other's styles, because it seems like we're seeing some of that in conservative publications and on, certainly cable talk shows is a lot of infighting rather than a willingness to accept one another's folkways. So what do you think explains that? Well, I think to some extent it's a lack of leadership. It's a lack of effective organizational adaptive change. Leadership really is largely about adapting to constant change, things that you can't control. In politics and public policy, we may want in some ways to have the same set of problems we had in 1985 or 1995 because we already had solutions at that time and you don't have to do any work. But the truth is that the problems do shift, the priorities shift.
We learned some tools that we've used in the past to advance freedom worked pretty well. Others didn't work like we thought. And so we have to change and do some other things. So I think part of it is a failure to be adaptive in our organizations and in recruiting and training leaders to be adaptive. But I frankly think another part of it is just we've lost a sense of what makes up, what we have in common. I mean, I just showed you these three traditions in a particular style of, in dancing, in hard shoe dancing. Well, actually it was very rough and tumble, and there was a lot of, there actually were fist fights between different groups of dancers and so forth. So it was kind of rough and tumble, but it came together because ultimately they started saying, you know, I may not like this person or I may not appreciate where this person's come from, but I can learn something. I can learn something new, can add that step to my repertoire. And I think when we talk to people who tend to think of politics in terms of liberty and limited government, and others who tend to think about politics in terms of virtue and order and tradition and social concerns, and others who might think about prudence and leadership in time of crisis and foreign policy challenges, these folks have things to learn from each other. And conservative organizations, conservative leaders used to understand that. I hope that they can understand it again, but we have lost some of that, I think, and it's time to get it back.
So tell me, some of these are maybe just philosophical differences, but what, for a practical person, what does any of this philosophical infighting, does that have an effect at the polls in terms of political outcomes or policy outcomes?
Well, certainly most voters are not calling up think tank websites as they walk into the polling place to carefully look to see which tax reform plan meets their 5 criteria. Of course, that's not realistic. But it is absolutely the case that just as American conservatives, modern conservatives, sort of come in these different flavors and mix and match these different tastes in their palate, so do voters. There are plenty of voters who are very skeptical about government taxes and government regulation, but have fairly liberal attitudes about social issues. There are others who have very conservative attitudes about social issues. There are people who are very conservative on issues like abortion or marriage, but aren't really worried about the entitlement state or taxes going up. I mean, they think corporations should pay more in tax. So these different kinds of flavors that we meet among intellectuals and activists and donors in the conservative world, it mirrors the general public. It's not as explicitly ideological or anything, but yes, you absolutely have these different groups. And the conservative movement, if you understand it as a political force, you're trying to elect conservatives to office, there are not enough libertarian type, and I don't mean the Libertarian Party, which is a very small thing. There's not enough libertarian-minded voters to get to a majority or plurality in pretty much any electorate. And there aren't enough virtue or tradition voters by themselves. And there aren't enough prudence voters by themselves. You have to build coalitions in order to get to 51% or to whatever the threshold is to win, just as the left does. The left has tensions too. Right now, they have somebody to organize around and sort of suppress their differences and focus on getting Donald Trump, for example. But I think that negative energy is never going to be enough to be a governing majority. The conservatives found that too. It's not enough to be against. You know, it may help you win an election. It doesn't help you govern a country. It's not enough.
So then part of the subtext I'm hearing is you need some kind of leadership, which of course SPN thinks a lot about at the state level and trying to build up leaders and think tanks and empower them to make change in their states. But an interesting phenomenon with this current, three-legged stool is that two legs seem to have turned on their party, or at least the party's leader, that they're more willing now to help the other party than to help their own president. And so I'm wondering, is that a more, in your estimation, more a matter of deep philosophical differences between the never-Trumpers and the pro-Trump people, or does it really boil down to their feelings about his personality?
I think that his personality, his personal style, his personal choices, his rhetoric, I think that's a very big part of it. But it's not the whole story. Remember that these tensions were evident before Donald Trump came down the escalator. Just as the difficulties we've seen in the general society of people talking to each other in a civil way and constructively engaging across political difference, that didn't start with the escalator event either. That predated it. In some ways, Trump was a symptom of it rather than a cause of it. But there are these ideological differences. There have always been these ideological differences. When people hearken back to Ronald Reagan, sometimes they do it for reasons that are really just nostalgia. Or I wish things were easier. They're sort of making that up. It wasn't so easy. But some of it is just about Reagan's style. It's not about his particular policy agenda. It's about being forceful and resolute and really having an aggressive agenda of conservative reform, but doing so with a smile, doing so with while also articulating a positive vision for the country that people who are not movement conservatives can feel at least somewhat good about. I mean, that's what you have to do, not only to win an election, but to sustain a political coalition long enough to affect permanent change, or at least lasting change.
So you shared with me once a class you teach, I want to say at our alma mater of University of North Carolina.
I teach at Duke University, actually.
Yeah, I think it was, yes, Duke.
Yep.
You hurt me, John. You just hurt me. But one
I
of the
go
things
where I'm led, as they say.
you showed 3 pictures to your students of, a kind of a stalwart traditionalist and then more of a libertarian. So say a little bit about that. What are those 3 pictures?
Sure. When I'm explaining to my Duke graduate students, and I've never had a conservative student in the class for years, I'm just telling you. So most of them are not familiar with what they're learning. When I show them a picture of Russell Kirk, who they often don't know who he is, and I use the quote where he really goes after libertarians. The libertarians and traditionalists can't get together. They're like fire and ice, and they couldn't possibly ally, says Russell Kirk. So I show the picture of him. Then I show a picture of Friedrich Hayek, and I quote from his famous essay, "Why I Am Not a Conservative." He means conservative in a European sense, but still, he talks about how it's not enough to simply be against progressives. You have to be for something. You have to be for the liberal tradition, meaning the libertarian or classical liberal tradition. So I show these 2 people criticizing the other side. And then I show Ronald Reagan with Russell Kirk and Ronald Reagan with Friedrich Hayek, all laughing, slapping each other on the back, because Reagan was the connective tissue. I mean, we talk about fusionism as a philosophical matter starting in the 50s and the 60s and National Review and all that stuff. But as a political matter, it really is something that you need a Ronald Reagan to not only bring together, but to sustain effectively over time.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you 2 more questions, and then we can open it up to the audience. One is, we hear a lot of negative things about where the culture is headed, the declining patriotism, declining civic knowledge, church attendance, all these things that suggest that hopes for a conservative or free market or pro-liberty movement are on the wane because of those longer term trends. What, in your view, are some positive trends that we could look to?
Well, if I'm talking as a policy nerd, which is okay, I suppose, that's part of my identity, I would say that we can look at some areas that we care about, things like school choice or healthcare reform, where you might think, well, school choice, we've been working on that for decades and we haven't transformed the entire market for education. Well, we got to be realistic, but I find it very, I find it a very positive development that we had fewer than 10% of American kids, K-12 kids, going to something other than a district public school not that long ago. And now it's over 20%, and it's going to grow every year. I think that's significant change and is heading towards a critical mass that will really affect the rest of the educational delivery system. And COVID-19, by the way, is a precipitating event that's going to push that process even more, I think. And then if we look at healthcare reform, back at the turn of the century, the percentage of Americans who were in consumer-driven health plans with health savings accounts or some other kind of system that people were paying cash for routine expenses, that's something conservatives talked about for a long time. And now we're over 30% of the marketplace is consumer-driven health plans, and that's also rising despite Obamacare. So I look at certain policies and I feel good, but I also look at rhetoric. I look at how people are changing their views about things like regulation. I'm seeing a lot more progressives, Tony, these days talking about zoning and land use and how it prices people out, particularly lower income people, out of the housing market in urban areas, way more than I heard 10 or 20 years ago. I think that's a positive sign and an augur of something good to come.
Okay, good. Well, final question. Given all these groups that are out there, trying to work for the cause of freedom, and given your sense of what trends you see and, you know, the opportunities maybe to repair this coalition moving in the same direction. What are good investments for people who want to put their time, their talent, their treasure into advancing human freedom and flourishing in the United States?
Well, I would say that there are two areas that I think we need to all be investing a lot more in. One of them is really understanding how political consensus happens, the political psychology behind issues. We tend to look at economics and look at political science, and that's fine. We need to be thinking a lot more about psychology and sociology and anthropology. How do human beings form the preferences they act on? And how can we as movement conservatives sort of play into that better, understand our audience better? And the other thing that I would say, as I mentioned this earlier, we simply need to invest in better leadership. I don't think you can leave leadership to chance. You have to develop it. You have to recruit people who are going to be leaders, cultivate them, train them, give them experience. And I don't just mean political leadership, like people going into office, though that's certainly part of it, but also people who are going to be civic leaders, leaders in their communities, forming the consensus of the future and really leading communities in the direction, positive or negative. We've been doing a lot of investments in that area over the years. We invest in a group called the Institute of Political Leadership, for which I'm currently chairman. And that really does do candidate training. And we're bipartisan. You need to be bipartisan to do a program like that, of course. And it's actually helpful when conservatives are in a program like that, learning how to run for school board or county commission or state legislature or Congress. It's actually helpful to have people from another persuasion in the room so you can do debates and have a lot of interaction. Another program that we invest in, based at Duke University, is the North Carolina Leadership Forum. This brings together current leaders. It's not a training program. It's really an engagement program for people who are already in public office or some other kind of civic leadership role across the state. We make sure it's balanced by party and race and other profession, other areas. We talk about an issue. And part of the purpose of the Leadership Forum is to get people to dig deep into an issue, really understand it. Last year it was school choice. The year before it was energy policy. The year before that it was poverty. So we talk about issues, and that's important. But the real, fundamental purpose is to build some relationships, some bridging relationships across the ideological divide. Not because we think all the progressives in the room are going to convert, or they think that all the conservatives in the room are going to convert, because that doesn't really happen. But if you know somebody from another political point of view, first of all, you know something you didn't previously know. You can kind of try to understand from their point of view why they think the way they think, which will help you be a more effective advocate. But also, when you know somebody else personally, when you've spent time with them, even if you disagree with them, you don't tend to demonize them as quickly. You don't tend to call them names. You don't tend to sort of act like a jackass. And it's not, I suppose that's not a very high bar, but I would very much like for these kinds of investments to lead to fewer people acting like that and more people acting like responsible adults. Even people who I'm never going to agree with, I should be able to argue with them without bickering with them, if you can see the distinction between the two.
Oh, absolutely. And that's music to our ears at SBN because, you know, as you well know, as a board member, we do a lot of investment in all levels within think tanks and other organizations in the states, trying to build up that general level of leadership. And then some new things we have going on, equipping them to reach out into their communities with the same goal, right? We don't necessarily need to convert everybody, but if we can get with social entrepreneurs of all stripes and try to solve some problems outside the government domain, well, that's every conservative, every person on the right probably ought to favor that. You know, if you can fix problems and you don't need the government to get involved, well, that's a win for everybody. So,
well, it's sort of like that Launchpad program that SPN has been doing. It. Anything that sort of embeds our conservative leaders at the grassroots level, embeds them in their communities more deeply, creates connections. Again, not just across left-right divide, but get more of our think tank people connected with business leaders, with social, as you said, social entrepreneurs, people who are working in the social sector, in the voluntary sector, solving problems. I think it enriches your public policy work. Mm-hmm. And it has the potential to actually make our communities better, which isn't that, after all, what we're all trying to do.
Yeah, and you can do it without compromising your principles, which is, I guess, the way to come back to the topic and round it out. Is we talked about these groups of people with very, very different traditions and strong points of view, but somehow they found a way to pull together in a general direction. And part of what we want to do at the micro level within states and communities now is that same kind of coalition building, not to water down our principles, but to find ways to get things done consistent with our principles outside the political sphere.
Well, to return to my tap dancing analogy for a second, when these different traditions blended together, they were greater than the sum of their parts. They found they didn't have to compromise. You didn't have to give up making a lot of noise flat on the ground, or being up and on your toes like those English hornpipe dancers were, or going really fast like those Irish jig dancers were. You don't have to give any of that up. You mix and match it together. Perhaps I should show you that too.
Please do.
Maybe that would be the best way to wrap this up. I'll give you an example of putting all this together. About that.
If I weren't trapped in the little box of my screen, I would give you a standing ovation, but this will have to do. So, well, John, thanks for answering my questions. And I know we've got a lot of folks who have their own questions, so I'm not going to monopolize the time any further. I'm going to hand it over and see what other folks have to ask.
All right.
Welcome back. Hope you guys enjoyed the tap dancing. I know it was certainly a highlight of my day, and honestly, probably the last 5 months. We'll be joined in just a moment by Tracy, John, and Tony to talk a little bit more about conservative fusionism, and we'll take your questions. So please take advantage of the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll keep the conversation going. So Tracy, let's start with you. You've been around a number of years. You've lived through a lot of this within this movement and in other realms. So what do you make of this conversation?
Well, Rebecca, SPN has always been about harnessing the power of coming together around common principles toward a common goal. This successful strategy, it stands out in these divisive times especially, but it's also what differentiates this network. You talked about me being around a while, for sure. Since SPN began in concept in the late 1980s, we built consensus around shared principles, what was and is a big tent approach. All of us seeking to promote the private voluntary solutions involving less government. Since then, SPN has worked to keep enough common ground among our groups so that we can get things done. Allies agree to share intel and accelerate their growth. And this connectedness, I think John referred to it as connective tissue, it's what SPN promotes. It's a winning combination to pressing our agenda in the States. And yes, I've lived and breathed this for over 20 years, and it's bringing together, again, as John said, these flavors, and it will continue to serve us well in the future.
Tracy, have you seen that this was easier maybe 20 years ago, and that we are at a time where it feels a little more fractured now? And if so, what does that mean for the future of SPN and our focus to knit people back together?
It's always been a challenge to some degree. You have to be vigilant to keep consensus and keep enough connectedness and agreement. You have to agree on enough things, but when SPN and the network, when we're focused more on solving problems than taking sides, we can really energize these alliances in the States. And that matters because our groups are closer to the action and the people affected by these policies. So it's our goal to seek enough common ground to, again, get things done. And it's what sets us apart. It's a commitment to getting results and a devotion, like the founders, to federalism and the knowledge that it is necessary to balance power in this country.
Great. Okay, thanks, Tracy. So I've got a few more questions for you guys, but first I want to address some of the questions that have come in from the audience prior to the show and during. So we'll get back to my questions in a few minutes. First, let's start with our friend Paul from Asheville, North Carolina. Paul Farago, so glad you're with us today. So we've been talking a lot about some of the fusionism on the center right. There's no doubt that the left has been experiencing something similar. And Paul's question is, what sort of self-destruction on the left would mark the end of our new progressive era? Do we think we could be seeing signs of that now? John, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that's an excellent and timely question. And I think we've all been watching the events of the last several months, and they have implications for all political movements, all political moments. But think in particular about the tensions we now see in the urban areas regarding the protests about George Floyd and other incidents of police misconduct, how those protests unfolded in the midst of a pandemic when other events were being suppressed or were being regulated away. That was allowed. Some of them devolved into riots. A lot of that, the damage, both physical and cultural damage, happened in cities that are run by progressive politicians, that are often populated by people who are progressive. And I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of, I wouldn't call it open warfare, but there's a lot of conflict between those who defend these protests and want them to continue on the left, and others who are in various positions, either of authority or in business or have property or homes or something downtown, who are very worried about the effects on the kind of urban lifestyle that progressives had been championing, transit-dependent, densely packed urban lifestyles. And similarly, when it comes to COVID-19, I mean, there's some of that too, that has to do with the urban model and how that interacts with the propensity for diseases to spread. But also, most recently in the last several weeks, as states and localities have begun to decide what to do with their school systems. And a lot of school systems, perhaps in deference to the teacher unions or to other political movements on the left, political institutions on the left, partly just because of panic, they've started to say, we're not going to come back to school in the fall. Well, there are a whole lot of left of center parents who are really angry, that they're at least frustrated. In a few more weeks, when they figure out what to do with their kids, they're going to be really angry. Some of them, I've even talked to a few of them, say, I'd never imagined homeschooling my kids. Or I never imagined sending my kids to a private school, but now I don't have any options. So there are tensions on the left, as I mentioned during the tape segment. We all know what they are. I think some of them have become very evident just in the last few months. And those could lead up to significant crack-ups of the progressive populist sort of coalitions that sustain the left in America.
Yeah, I would just add to that with the school closures, John, how that affects some of the more vulnerable populations. Think about single moms, how difficult that is for them.
And also it's very easy for people who live in urban enclaves. I won't get into too many stereotypes, but it's very easy for them to say, we'll just do it online. But what about all the folks who live in communities where there's not good broadband? They can't afford good broadband. They don't have good computer devices. Even if the school system hands them out, the parents don't know how to set them up. They're not provided sufficient help. This will aggravate learning gaps by geographic region, by race, by ethnicity. It's undeniably so.
Yeah. Thanks, John and Tracy. Okay, next question, Tony. This one's for you from our friend Britt Paul. It's a great question, Britt. Is the current problem that defining things like free market and limited government has become contentious? For example, people on the right have become increasingly protectionist and anti-trade. Some people can't agree on what a free market means on even the most basic level. So Tony, is that where the fracturing's coming from? And what do you see as a path forward in terms of, if we're talking about where we can agree, what's a first step in your mind?
Well, I think there's definitely an element of one's approach to trade and free markets that separates people on the right. I wouldn't call the people who are not free trade absolutists anti-trade. I mean, for the most part, we've always justified free trade in consequentialist terms, utilitarian terms. It makes people better off. And so to me, it's within the legitimate bounds of debate among conservatives to ask whether people are better off when 90% of the medical supplies you need in a pandemic are made in the country that unleashed the pandemic. So these are, to me, legitimate debates within that community, the conservative community, but they certainly highlight differences of emphasis between folks who maybe attach more moral value to free markets as compared to people who've always viewed markets as means to some other ends, and who don't necessarily believe that the best way to think of mankind is in terms of homo economicus, consuming man, and want to make more of a place for creative man, which then leads to arguments about where you source your manufacturing and that kind of thing. So it's an element of it, but I wouldn't characterize it as a departure from the orthodoxy by some people who used to be in the fold. There was always a tension between people who valued markets almost in a moral sense, in some cases like Ayn Rand, truly in a moral sense, and those who've always viewed markets as just a means of making people better off, and therefore subject to changes if you start to believe that they're not making people as well off as they should.
Do you see perhaps the idea of federalism and a focus on local is better as being a issue area where people could start to rally around and at least start to have some common ground before getting so caught up in argument over things like free trade? Well,
sure. I mean, part of the argument for federalism, for local self-governance, is you get a lot of experiments. And so if, some communities have a conviction that they ought to really, keep out the big companies and really promote local industry, they can try it out. And other communities that want to be wide open, any big company that wants to come work here, come on, bring your factories. Federalism allows you to see what works. And it also allows for communities to kind of, pair their policies to what they think are the needs of the people. So I think most conservatives have always favored that approach versus a few, geniuses in Washington telling all of us how we'll be better off.
Very well said. Thank you. Okay, next question from Ed Johnson. Ed, so glad you're back to the show this week. This one I'd like to direct towards you, John. How do you define conservatism as we know it today?
Well, one way to define that phrase as we know it would be as it is practiced rather than as it is theorized. I like theory. I read philosophy books for pleasure, which is kind of embarrassing to admit. But for most people, and most of us who are in the movement, we're mostly interested in what do these ideas look like when they're translated to actual policies. And when you think about it in those terms, we don't really debate in actual politics, whether it's state, federal, or local. We don't debate whether to have large chunks of the government that we have, at least at the state and local level. Obviously, we could debate that a lot at the federal level, and we do some extent at the state. But a lot of it has to do with, for example, if you're going to have a significant investment in education at the state and local level, which we have had for generations, and that's likely to continue, then what should that look like on the ground? Does it look like a set of geographically specific, geographically assigned monopoly schools? Or does it look like a rather wide range of districts and charter schools operating as independent public schools and private schools that receive some kind of where the students receive some kind of assistance from the state or tax credits, and private schools that refuse even that, and homeschooling and hybrid models that mix some days a week at home, some days a week at school. Now, of course, I'm articulating the latter view because it's, I think, more to our liking and more interesting and more likely to succeed. And by the way, getting a whole lot more momentum right now under COVID-19. But that's an example of conservatism as it really is, as we see it today, is more choice and competition, whether it's in education or healthcare, or we might even say transportation and housing. Do people have agency to make their own decisions? Maybe they have a subsidy, maybe they don't, but they have the agency to make their own decisions about what services they're going to purchase at what price from which provider, or is it more of a command and control approach? And then another example would be, I think conservatism as we know it includes thinking beyond the immediate horizon, thinking about the future. So while there is a tremendous amount of support for doing all sorts of things in response to COVID-19, the conservatives, the real conservatives in the room, again, whether it be in Congress or at the state level or at the local level, are asking questions like, if we issue $2 trillion more in debt, how does that affect our children? How does that affect our government in the long run? If we create reforms in the short term or programs in the short term to ameliorate immediate needs that people have in this crisis, will that affect their incentives? Will it discourage them from taking a job? How will it affect resiliency in the future? If you bail out governments or private institutions that don't have adequate reserves for a crisis, then are they going to have even lower levels of reserves for next year's crisis or next decade's crisis? These are the kinds of concerns that conservatives, properly understood, have. And to the extent that conservatism is evident in our political conversation, they're asking these questions.
So, John, I think that you're preaching to the choir, at least at the moment. So Ed's follow-up question is a good one, which is, what exactly do you perceive as the challenges in messaging the superiority of these ideas, conservatism as we know it, just to regular people? We just had a great education, school choice reform right here in South Carolina, and smart people I know and admire are really up in arms about it on Facebook, and it makes my head explode. So what's the challenge here? What's stopping these people from getting it? It's so obvious when you say it.
Well, there are a lot of different theories about this based on probably different polls or different ways the poll questions are asked or how to interpret the marketing information. If you think about polls and surveys and anecdotes and people we know, it's all market research that we're trying to use to market our ideas. And really for groups like SPN think tanks around the country, while they generate some new ideas, most of the ideas that we are working with are familiar. They already exist. They pre-exist us. We're really marketing ideas. That's our job, is marketing. And when you think about it in those terms, my own view, my own reading of the evidence is that our problem is not really even our terms. Conservative is still a much more familiar and more positive term than progressive or liberal is or socialist is. In general, people will say that they favor a smaller government. It depends, and it fluctuates over time. Our problem is when you get into specifics. So people will say, the government's too big, it's wasting all this money, I wish taxes were lower, Social Security should be expanded. Because when you get into specific applications, Social Security and Medicare or K-12 and teacher pay, people are sort of conservative in general, and they're more progressive in specific. And so we've got to be more specific. We've got to say that our solution, whether it's the issue you mentioned of school choice now in the advent of, in the face of COVID, and maximizing the opportunity for parents to align the best opportunity to mix safety and educational equality for their children and so forth. We've got to talk about it in very practical terms about solving a particular problem. Housing is too expensive. I don't have anywhere to send my kid, and I'm supposed to go back to work, and the schools aren't open, and what am I supposed to do? Or I need some health care. I'm nervous about going to the doctor's office or the hospital. I wish there was some other way I could consult my doctor, like telemedicine. Okay, we talk about specific solutions to the problems that people have in their everyday lives. In my opinion, we will more successfully market conservatism to those who either don't currently embrace it or who embrace it in theory, but then kind of they move away from that in practice.
We've seen some of this shift across the network more recently. They're a little less think tanky and more solution centers, especially in policy applied at the last mile, for sure, on the ground.
Great point, Tracy. Okay, we usually wrap up around 1:45, but we still have a few great questions. So if you need to jump off, we'll be sure to send you the video. If you can stay with us, hang out just for a couple more, because there's still some good questions to get to. Okay, here we go. Here's the big one. How can the Republican Party retain the support of Trump voters after he's gone? What does it all mean?
Well, that is a big question that requires bigger answers than either I possess or have time to deliver, or both. But I will make a couple of points. Number one, the real way to answer that question is to ask it again after November, because some of it depends on whether Trump is reelected or is not reelected. If he's not reelected, particularly if he's not reelected by a large margin, That's one set of challenges. But a different one is if he's reelected by a small margin, or maybe or maybe loses by a small margin, then how much recrimination is there going to be within the movement? If he loses in a landslide, I think that it becomes actually, while it's damaging to conservatism in some ways, it's also an easier way to think through what the next steps are. But what I would say about this is conservatives who dislike Trump for his personality, his style, background, whatever, but who appreciate, for example, court picks or tax cuts or deregulation, in order for them to appeal to future Trump voters who may not think the same way. In other words, they may like him because of his personality, but aren't that interested in his tax cuts for business. The way to think about that is to constantly focus, for example, on two things that you have in common. One of them is your adversary, which is the left. That is unifying, and that's just a fundamental nature of politics. But the other thing is the accomplishments that you believe happened during the Trump years that you like for policy reasons. Emphasize that a lot, because people who will look back with some nostalgia about Trump will probably want to hear good things about what happened during the Trump years. And so even if they weren't originally the kinds of voters who are really burning with passion about the corporate income tax or something like that, I think that one way to hold them together is to emphasize the parts of the Trump agenda that enacted that you could describe as positive or successful, and avoid the endless recriminations that are going to happen. There are going to be a lot of people blaming each other for whatever happens or doesn't happen. And in my view, as we try to move forward as a movement at the state level, across the country, to focus on what solutions we have to the problems that people are worried about is almost always going to pay off more than trying to think through elaborate strategies about particular politicians in the rearview mirror.
Thanks. Great question from Anthony. Now I've got a question from Stephen Schultz. Thanks for joining us, Stephen. What efforts do you think will be successful at expanding the conservative base to different ethnic and minority groups? And I would actually take that question one step further. And Tracy, I'd like to hear from you on this. And really just, you talked about bringing center-right folks together where they agree. You've been talking a lot lately about how we've got to expand to work with folks who we haven't in the past, who maybe we don't agree with on everything, but we agree with a couple of things to really get something done. And so even beyond just different ethnic and minority groups, just folks who we've never worked with before that have different ideas.
Sure. Expanding the reach of the network is one component of the broader necessary capacities needed overall. It's like a healthy, balanced diet that lead to more successful organizations. This network is devoted to innovation and continuous learning. And so that requires connecting talent from a broad spectrum of backgrounds, experiences, race, cultures. That combined with a relentless curiosity for a healthy variation of perspectives all around a common set of principles will really help us solve some of the most pressing problems in creative ways. No doubt, an overly homogenous set of leaders and influencers limits our ability to generate new and innovative methods. And it's made more acute in this increasingly diverse and interconnected world, which is now in crisis. So we press on to try to forge these new alliances.
So when we talk about these new alliances and what specifically we can do, just one example of expanding our own reach. Tony, I'm putting you on the spot here. Can you talk a little bit about Launchpad that John Hood mentioned in your video? Just give us a kind of quick overview on why it matters and how that's going to expand this kind of reach in our audiences.
Sure. So we brought together what we call our brain trust members, who are entrepreneurs who built businesses. They know how to get things done. We get them in the same room for several days with social entrepreneurs. So it could be somebody running a think tank. So it could be somebody trying to figure out how to get, better meals in schools. Just people who are trying to make some kind of change in their communities, and their first choice is not to have the government do it for them. And so these business leaders work with them over the course of several days to build actual business plans with financials and the whole deal, marketing plan, everything. So they take it from a set of aspirations for which you're asking for charity to a business investment that you could take out into your community and try to get enough funds to experiment with it. And so our point of view is the more we do that in states, the more we're reaching out to people who may not vote the way we vote, but they want to fix something in their community and they don't want government to do it, which means they're friends of ours. And so this is a way to bring some of the business expertise we can tap, get it in there in those communities and start to solve some problems and maybe get to know each other better so we can solve other problems.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question from Christy Herrera. This is a great one, Christy. Who in the conservative movement is doing fusionism well?
Can I just volunteer SPN?
Yes. Yes, and we're learning as
Well
we go.
said.
And I'm not just saying that because I have a board member and my boss on the call, although I hope you both heard that. The main reason is because we've got, in this network, we've got think tanks that are in that more free market, space. They're all about, let's get maximum prosperity in our state. We've got others that care also about some traditional values things, and they're coming at schools, for example, to give parents more control because of their convictions about what children should learn. And so there's room in this network for the folks who are free trade all the time, the folks who are free trade, but let's punish China, the people who are focused on education, crime. There's room for all of them. And that's our point of view, is that we don't want to dictate the conversation and the orthodoxy. As long as you're for freedom and local self-governance, there's a place for you in this network.
Very well said. Okay. Anything to add, Tracy and John?
Well, I'd say that, and again, this is somewhat that COVID-19 has kind of outstripped other events and other priorities that are happening, but a number of our governors around the states have been working on, I'm thinking of DeSantis in Florida, and Abbott in Texas, and governors in a number of other states in the South, the Midwest, the Northeast even, have been working on both free market ideas, on taxes, regulations, governing the state spending, those kinds of matters, as well as concerns that, as Tony was getting at, that combine, for example, consumer choice, which we might argue is a sort of classical liberal theme, with the need for education to be more than just reading, writing, and arithmetic, and actually instill values and principles, which comes out of that classical conservative tradition. So classical liberal and classical conservative ideas, when they are together, are a potent force.
Yeah. Well, John, you and Tony talked a lot about, you've got to have leadership, adaptability. We've talked today about needing to listen to folks and not just enter a conversation ready to win it all the time, but to really understand folks who aren't usually with us. And we've talked a lot about coming together where we agree. Other than those handful of principles to guide us moving forward, what else do we need to make sure we do so that in the year 2030, we're not having a conversation like this coming from, a really bad, scary place? So in 2030, we feel like, hey, we're in a good spot. We did it.
Well, if we're going to be good American conservative fusionists, then we should recognize that in 2030, we're going to be frustrated about things. And in 2040, we're going to be frustrated about things because human beings have a nature. It's a real thing. You could think it's a God-created nature or it is a natural creation of evolution. It doesn't make any difference what the origin is. The truth is we have a fixed human nature that both propels us towards wonderful things and tends to tempt us into doing horrible things. So what I would feel better about in 2030, because we're not going to fix all the problems, we're going to have new problems, but I would feel better about, for example, is that our conservative activists, our free market activists around the country, they have really good friends who have different views. And they check in with them fairly often, not just for like focus grouping or marketing or sort of instrumentalist reasons, but because they're actually friends. And that some of those friends will include, if we're talking about people, for example, who are white and male, as I am, people who are female and African-American and Hispanic and Asian, and people from people who are recent immigrants and people who are native born for 6 generations and so forth, to have a variety of a network of different kinds of people who are part of your world, part of that 150 or so people who on average, the average human being can have a real relationship with over the course of his or her life. It's actually about 150 people. and make sure that 150 people includes a lot of people who don't look like you, sound like you, and think like you. And you will be a more effective leader for whatever cause you're advocating, in this case, conservatism.
Thanks, John. Okay, guys, thanks for hanging in for the majority of an hour. We will close out in just a moment. Tracy, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I'll just wrap up. This conversation's reminded me of a quote from Frederick Douglass, is I would unite with anybody to do right and with nobody to do wrong. And this network has been about coalescing around a common passion, right? The private voluntary solutions adopted through a federalist system where the states are these laboratories of democracy. So I'll wrap up by saying we resolutely press on through adapted leaders and adapting ourselves to this disruption to resist the protectionist order that's upon us.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, John. And thank you, Tony. Thanks to everybody who dialed in today. Stephen Schultz did have one more question asking how conservatives are reaching young people. And spoiler alert, Stephen, we are actually going to have a whole show about engaging young Americans on the ideas of liberty at 1 o'clock on Wednesday, August 5th. So we will answer your question during that show. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.